By sunrise, my dog wouldn't go past the back steps. The yard he ran every morning now had silver posts like exclamation points, marching where grass used to be. Out here in Casey County, a line isn't just a line, it's an understanding. You know this if you've ever watched two neighbors shake hands over a strip of pasture and then honor it for 20 years. A fence changes more than a view, it changes how men look at each other at the feed store. Land carries memory, and memory keeps score. I'm 42, fourth generation on 80 acres my granddad stitched together after the war. The backyard isn't fancy, just a garden, a swing that creaks, the big sycamore that throws shade on July afternoons. My father's limestone corner marker sits like a tooth at the edge of our property. At least, it always did. Now there was a new line, straight as a ruler, running 10 feet inside my grass. T-posts, welded wire, and a galvanized gate I didn't install. Earl Sutton moved in last fall on the track behind me, a retired contractor from Tennessee with a new barn and a drone he liked to fly over his hay. Folks said he was particular. Particular turns into territorial when a man decides the map is a suggestion. You don't need mystique to understand it. You just need a tape measure and pride. If you've ever had someone redraw your space with their tools, you know the feeling sitting between your ribs. I walked the fence once, slow, counting steps from the sycamore to the creek bend, checking the old stakes I keep painted every spring. My dog whined. Across the new gate, Earl stood with a coffee and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," he said, like we were talking about weather. I told him the posts were on my side. He said his survey said otherwise. He didn't offer to show it. He did say, "Figured we'd settle it the clean way." Out here, clean means final. I nodded, because patience is a tool too. I told him I'd be back with paper, not a pair of bolt cutters. Then I turned around and went to the house to pull my deed and the map my dad kept in a zippered binder, the one that still smelled like old leather and diesel. I spread the binder on the kitchen table and read the meets and bounds like a recipe I'd learned as a kid. Beginning at the limestone at the base of the sycamore, thence north 87 degrees west. My dad penciled notes in the margin years ago. Tiny arrows, a check mark by. Iron pin set. The coffee went cold while I traced the line with my finger. If you've ever had to defend something you didn't build but promised to keep, you know the mix of duty and annoyance that settles in your shoulders. The clerk's office smelled like paper and floor wax. Maggie at the counter didn't bother with small talk. She slid the big plaid books onto the table like she'd been waiting for me. We found a 1996 survey, Boyle Surveying, stamped and signed. It called out the same sycamore, the limestone, the creek bend. There was even a note. Found existing rebar, cap. That word found matters. Found means it was already there, not guessed. I paid for copies, took photos on my phone, and asked for the PVA printout. She handed me the GIS map with the usual disclaimer, approximate only. It was close enough to make me feel sane. Back home, I walked the line with a 100-foot tape and a handful of orange flags. I worked slow, checking bearings with a cheap compass and the way the creek curled. At the sycamore's north side, a root lifted the soil just enough to make a hard spot. I knelt and scraped with a trowel. Metal hit metal. 2 inches down, I saw the top of a rusty rebar with a faded yellow cap. BLS 96. I stood there a minute, dirt under my nails, and let that settle. You can call it evidence, or you can call it memory made visible. Either way, it was the kind of thing that kept neighbors honest long before drones and gates. I called Hanley Surveying in Liberty and got a slot for Thursday. The secretary warned me they were backed up with fence fights and driveway easements. Estimate was $900 to $1,200. Depending on brush. I said fine. Sometimes you pay to turn a feeling into a number. I emailed Earl a photo of the rebar, the plat, and a short note. I'm hiring a licensed surveyor. Please don't attach anything permanent until he marked. I kept it plain. No threats, no heat. Earl replied an hour later. Do what you gotta do. That told me he wasn't backing off, but he'd read the room. I planted one of the orange flags by the rebar and another at the creek bend where the old map said the corner sits. The wind tugged them like little tongues of fire. My dog finally ventured past the steps and sat beside me. Lines can be argued, pins can't. I didn't feel victorious, just steady, like the land and I were speaking the same language again. Thursday would turn it from talk to marks in the ground. By Wednesday morning, Earl had strung 2 lines of welded wire and hung a "No Trespassing" sign that faced my kitchen window like a dare. He moved with the brisk confidence of a man who thinks momentum equals correctness. If you've ever been on the wrong side of someone else's certainty, you know how loud a staple gun can sound in your own yard. I kept my hands in my pockets and let the camera on my phone do the talking. Photos every 10 feet. The rebar, the sycamore, the creek bend, a timestamp tucked in the corner. Word travels here without phones. At the feed store, Joe Baker raised his eyebrows before I said hello. He didn't pick sides. He rarely does. He just muttered that Earl likes a line that looks good from the road. Then Joe tapped the counter and said, "Bite with paper, not with posture." That's the kind of advice old men in ball caps hand out like penny candy, and it sticks because it's right. I bought mineral for the heifers and went home steady. I laid out chalk from the sycamore to the creek like a school project and set more flags. I printed the 1996 plat and the county map, slid them into sheet protectors, and tucked a certified letter into an envelope for Earl. Simple sentence, stated dispute, pending survey, request to pause permanent work. I called the sheriff's office and asked to file an information report. The dispatcher was polite. "Civil matter," she said. I knew that. Still, she gave me a case number. Paper trails don't stop trouble, but they show you were walking on the right side of it. That evening Earl met me at his new gate with a plastic sleeve in his hand. He called it a survey. It looked like a GIS printout from a phone app. No stamp, no bearings, no notes. "Creek moved in 18 after that flood," he said. "Lines move with water." He wasn't completely wrong in theory, but this creek hadn't carved a new bed. It still curled around my garden the way my dad's map showed. I kept my voice even. I told him I'd go with whatever a licensed surveyor marked and asked him, again, to hold off. He shrugged. "Can't unroll progress," he said, and walked away. If you dealt with a man who treats speed like proof, you know that shrug. Thursday, a white pickup with Hanley Surveying on the door rolled down my lane just after 8. Tripods clinked, and a guy in a sun hat introduced himself as Kyle. My dog finally wagged his tail like someone had returned a borrowed tool. Earl was already at his fence, arms crossed, coffee steaming. There's a quiet moment before tape and math turn into stakes in the dirt. It's the pause between talk and truth. I stood at the sycamore and felt that pause settle, ready to see where the ground said the line really was. Kyle laid out a tripod, prism pole, and GPS rover like a careful mechanic. He set a base on my driveway, waited for satellites to settle, then knelt at the sycamore. "Found cap from 96, he said, brushing dirt from the yellow plastic. Earl drifted over with his coffee and that squared stance. Kyle read bearings for his notes. Steady voice. No debate. The ground was going to speak, and he was just the microphone. We worked the line slow. At the creek bend, he paused. "Deed says to the center line of stream, thence with meanders," he murmured, studying the banks the way a doctor studies an x-ray. "This channel's been stable a long time. If it jumped in 18, it jumped back." He explained the difference between slow accretion and sudden avulsion, and how only one moves a boundary. He wasn't lecturing. He was translating the earth into numbers. If you've ever argued with a map on your phone, you know the relief when the actual ground answers. By noon, he'd marked 4 corners and set hubs with little nails that winked in the sun. The line from the sycamore to the creek told a plain story. Earl's fence sat about 9 feet onto my side for most of its run, 12 at the fattest belly. Kyle measured the offsets with the prism and called them out. I wrote them on a flap torn from a mineral bag. He tied ribbon to a hub and wrote, "Line, big enough to read from stubbornness." Earl kept repeating he'd seen a map that put him right. Kyle didn't argue. "Hand me the stamp and the bearings and I'll compare," he said. Earl had neither. At the tailgate, Kyle printed a field sketch. Bearings, distances, corner notes. "BLS 96 cap found. Rebar set." He signed and dated it. "Treat this as preliminary," he said. "Full drawing next, but the monuments control." Monuments control. My dad said that like a prayer. If you've ever guarded ground that raised you, you know how that lands. The memory in the metal beats the picture on a screen. Earl folded his copy until it fit his fist. No apology. Men rarely offer one when the verdict arrives as a map. He said he'd study on it. I told him I'd send the final survey and asked again, then he paused the wire. He didn't promise, but he didn't add a post either. After the truck pulled away, I ran bright mason line from hub to hub and drove 2 scrap stakes where his fence crossed the true boundary. The twine wasn't much, but it redrew the yard in the right shape. My dog finally stretched in the shade like he trusted the outline again. By afternoon, I had paper thick enough to feel like a plan. If you dealt with a neighbor who confuses firmness with meanness, you know why plans matter. They steady your voice. I called my Farm Bureau agent to log a boundary encroachment and sent photos. I printed Kyle's field sketch and slipped it into a binder labeled fence. Then I wrote a one-page notice. License survey located the true line. Your fence encroaches. Please relocate within 14 days. Options attached. I sent it certified and dropped a copy in his mailbox. Options matter when you want peace to survive the fix. I offered to split the cost of a proper line fence if he'd set it on the monument. I even offered to help pull his wire if he'd call it a mistake, not a win. That isn't generosity. It's insurance against years of side-eye at church and quiet storms at the feed store. Out here, you either invest in neighbor capital up front or pay interest forever. Friday morning, I stopped by the county attorney during public hours. He didn't sell me outcomes. He just confirmed the obvious. Civil matter, keep documenting, don't touch his materials. He tapped Monuments Control on Kyle's sketch and said, "That's your anchor." Walking out, I wasn't mad. I was resolved. If you've ever held a line that raised you, you know the difference. Anger burns quick. Resolve runs cool and long. Back home, I mowed to the Mason line like it was a parade route. If you've ever marked a boundary you mean to defend, you know how the mower feels different. Each pass a sentence written in grass. I set 2 game cameras low along the disputed strip. Not for drama, just for record. Earl watched from his porch and pretended not to. He trimmed his side tight. A barber's cut against my orange flags, the no trespassing sign still glaring at my kitchen window. Just before supper, Kyle emailed the stamped drawing, bearings, distances, the creek note about avulsion, the BLS 96 cap circled like a conclusion. He added a line. Encroachment ranging 7 feet minus 12 inches, 3 foot along 147, 8 of shared boundary. Numbers cool arguments to room temperature. I slid the printout under Earl's gate with my notice, and a yellow swipe across relocate within 14 days. The dog settled beside me on the steps while the crickets wound up. When my phone buzzed, it was a short text from Earl. Come by tomorrow, 8 a.m. At 8 sharp, I walked over with the binder under my arm. Earl waited on his porch with 2 empty lawn chairs set like they expected a deal to sit between them. He opened with the line men use when they want to win politely. Let's split the difference. I told him there wasn't any to split. The monuments fixed the boundary. Kyle's stamp just translated it. If you've ever had someone frame compromise as a discount on your own rights, you know why my jaw went quiet. He tried the creek again, then the flood, then a new angle. His paddock would square better if the fence stayed where he'd put it. He'd poured concrete on 2 corner posts. I laid out the options I'd already written. Move the fence to the monuments, split cost on a proper line fence, or, if he really wanted the extra strip, buy it clean with a deed, new description, and recording fees. Not a ransom, I said. A transfer. He blinked at the word fees like it was a foreign expense. A straight line is cheap until it runs through someone else's title. Joe Baker rolled up on his four-wheeler like he'd misplaced a morning and found it in our conversation. He didn't take a side. He took a fact. Boys, you can fight the numbers, but you'll lose to the courthouse copy machine, he said, sipping from a thermos. He looked at Earl. You keep a bite of his yard, and your grand could sell a headache. Title companies don't drink coffee. That landed better than my binder. Earl's shoulders dropped a notch. He asked what a deed would take. I told him we'd need Kyle to draft a new description, a deed from me to him for however many square feet, maybe a boundary line agreement to fix the rest, and a check. Also, new taxes. I wasn't pushing a sale. I was refusing a shortcut. If you've ever guarded something you plan to hand down, you know the difference between being stubborn and being careful, he said. I ain't buying dirt. I can't mow today. That clarified his motive more than any argument. We stood quiet long enough to hear a calf bawl across my field. Finally, he asked for time. Give me the weekend. I'll pull the wire and reset to your pins if that's what it takes. I told him I'd hold off filing anything until Monday. I handed him a copy of the 14-day notice anyway and marked the 2 encroaching corners with orange tape so there'd be no guesswork. Back home, I texted Kyle to set laid stakes along the line so a blind man could follow it. I stacked a couple of new T-posts by the barn, not to threaten, just to show I was ready to build the right thing in the right place. Weekends teach you who your neighbor wants to be. This one was about to tell me. Saturday started with Kyle's truck on gravel and laid stakes going in like stitches. He ran blue ribbon along the true line, so even a hurried man couldn't miss it. I rented a manual post puller from the co-op and set it by the gate. Earl rolled up mid-morning with his son-in-law and a skid steer. He pointed at the 2 corner posts he'd set in concrete and said they were too good to waste. That was the hinge of his pride, money in the ground, and a weekend burned. I kept it simple. Good work in the wrong spot stays wrong, I said, and rested my hand on the ribbon. He looked at the binder, then the stakes, then the skid steer like it might vote. Momentum met geometry and lost. We worked, not as friends, but as men who hated dragging this into Monday. Wire came down in long, sighing sheets. The puller walked steel out of clay one rhythm at a time. Kyle checked each move and called online when a T-post clicked into the right arc. If you've ever put something back where it belongs, you know the relief shows up as quiet. The yard widened. My dog tested the new old edge and lay in the shade like he'd been guarding it all along. The concrete corners were last. The skid steer rocked them loose with a chain. Earl winced at the waist. I offered to split new bags and help Tamp if he'd set them on the hubs. That wasn't mercy. It was an exit ramp he could take without folding his pride flat. Joe Baker idled by long enough to say, "A straight fence is cheaper than a crooked deed," then puttered off. By late afternoon, the wire ran true from the sycamore to the creek, tight enough to hum. Earl didn't apologize. He did ask to borrow my post level. I handed it over. "Keep it square," I said. He set the last line post on the nail in Kyle's hub. When the sun dropped, the blue ribbon fluttered against steel. Paper had turned into ground again. I rinsed clay from the puller and leaned it by the barn, ready to draft the boundary line agreement Monday. Sunday night, I laid the binder open on the table and wrote two titles on a yellow pad: Boundary Line Agreement and Temporary Access License. Lines keep peace, but paper keeps memory. If you've ever fixed a mess the right way once, so you don't relive it for years, you know why I drafted both. The first would say the monuments control, and the fence now matches them. The second would let Earl move hay through my strip for 30 days while he rebuilt his paddock. Permission on paper, not a forever right. Monday morning, Kyle emailed a meets and bounds for the shared line and a sketch stamped clean. I carried it to the county attorney during walk-in hours. He circled two phrases to include: "No adverse possession claimed," and "No prescriptive rights intended." Plain words that closed doors quietly. I typed the agreement at the library, printed 2 copies, and clipped Kyle's drawing behind them. The clerk highlighted the recording fees and slid a notary stamp across the counter like a baton. If you've ever watched a courthouse turn feelings into file numbers, you know the comfort of structure. I called Earl from the parking lot and asked him to meet me at the bank. He showed with his son-in-law, hat in hand, pride still upright. He read every line like it might bite. He asked for one change: no admission of fault. Fine by me. The map already said what needed saying. We signed. The notary thumped her stamp, and I paid the recording fee. I handed him the one-page access license with the dates boxed in heavy ink and a simple route sketched to his gate. "Permission, not a pipeline," I said. He nodded. That small dignity, being allowed to tidy his side without looking beaten, cost me nothing and bought a lot. Back at the clerk's office, the copier warmed, the red stamp hit the corner, and the clerk read out book and page like coordinates, evidence you can point to without raising your voice. I texted Earl the numbers. He replied, "M. Appreciate the straight dealing." When I pulled into my drive, the "no trespassing" sign had been turned to face his way, then taken down. The new line wire shone like a fresh pencil mark. My dog trotted it end to end as if checking Kyle's math. I pulled the mason line and left the laid stakes for a week, just to teach the ground its outline again. That evening, I set 3 treated posts along our side where a proper board fence would go come fall, not to wall anyone out, just to give the land a backbone you could see. Earl's drone buzzed for a minute, then hovered on his side and slid away. If you've ever been through a boundary fight, you know the sound of a yard exhaling. Tomorrow I'd start setting boards, slow and true, from the sycamore to the creek. Tuesday I set the first run of boards from the sycamore, 2x6 treated, gapped a finger width for wind. The post level Earl borrowed came back with a fresh scratch on it and a quiet "Thanks." A good fence does more than divide. It teaches 2 yards how to breathe. If you've ever lived with friction, you know how structure feels like mercy. At the creek, Kyle showed me how to build a water gap, swinging slats on wire so a flood can lift and settle without tearing the whole run out. Boundaries need flex where water talk. He tapped the bank and said, "Let the stream keep its job. The line keeps yours. If you've ever tried to hold everything stiff, you know the relief of leaving one smart hinge in the system. The Farm Bureau adjuster emailed that my file was closed with "no loss," which read better than any apology. At the feed store, Joe grinned at the stamped copy I kept folded in my pocket like a talisman. "Monuments one," he said, and rang up Mineral like he was ringing a bell. Word had softened. Earl nodded when we crossed in the parking lot and asked how many boards I planned. 3 high, I said. "Neat," he answered, which is country for truce. By week's end, the GIS map updated with a thin black line that matched Kyle's drawing. The clerk texted book and page for our agreement, and I wrote them on the inside cover of the binder like coordinates to calm. Earl mowed to the new line and flew his drone only on his side. He left a cold Dr. Pepper on my porch rail. No note, just condensation making a ring. Sometimes that's as much as a man says. Saturday, he walked over with his hat in his hands and a crooked sketch. He wanted to square his paddock by buying a small wedge at the far corner, 3 feet at the fence tapering to nothing, about the size of a pickup bed. "Clean, recorded, your price, I pay all costs," he said. I told him we could do it if the oak by the bin stayed on me, and the deed said no further claims. He nodded. I called Kyle for a meets and bounds on the sliver and penciled Monday at the bank. The boards to the creek were tight and true. The last stretch waited, quiet as a held breath. Monday, Kyle met us at the bank with a fresh sketch for the little wedge Earl wanted. 3 feet at the corner tapering to nothing, the oak excluded in bold. The county attorney slid the deed across the desk and had us initial 2 lines. No further claims, monuments control. Earl paid every fee and handed me a check that felt less like money and more like acknowledgement. Kyle set a short rebar at the new point and tapped it with his hammer like a period at the end of a sentence. If you've ever bargained from firm ground, you know how calm the room gets. Back home, I ran the last boards to the creek and hung a gate that swung level on the first try. The water gap moved like a wrist, ready for a storm without surrendering the line. Earl mowed to his side and stayed there. We exchanged a plain nod. No victory speech. Men out here measure respect by how little needs to be said after the paperwork stamp's dry. Joe drove by slow, lifted 2 fingers from his steering wheel, and called, "Straight looks good," which is high praise in a county that values quiet competence. The clerk texted book and page numbers for the deed and the boundary agreement, and I wrote them inside the binder cover. I slid a photo of my dad at the same sycamore under the plastic, his hand on the old limestone. A fence is boards and wire, but it's also a line through time. If you've ever had to reclaim something simple that shouldn't have been argued in the first place, you know the satisfaction isn't loud. It's a door latching, a hinge oiled, a dog choosing the shade again. I walked the hubs with a paint can and gave each a bright ring so they'd be easy to find 10 years from now. The drone buzzed once, high and polite, then drifted back to Earl's barn. He texted later about borrowing my post driver. I said sure, leave it by the sycamore when you're done. That's how peace keeps itself. Small trades, clean records, lines you can point to without raising your voice. At dusk I stood by the limestone tooth, the boards running true to the creek, the water talking to its own channel. The yard felt like itself again. No borrowed inches, no borrowed pride. My dog trotted the length and flopped like he'd finished a job. Owning land isn't conquest, it's stewardship, and stewardship needs boundaries you're willing to defend with paper and patience. The night took the last shine off the wire, and the farm settled. The line wasn't a wall, it was a promise kept.